But it's a good point. Certainly, I think in fiction that you can you can and many people have done very scary stories that have nothing to do with the paranormal.
People are horrifying.
Yeah, and I mean, given your work, I'm sure you know that better than anyone.
Yeah. To be brief about it, it's Bianca Jones versus terrorist,
Oh,
Hmm.
and
I mean, yeah.
it introduces the theme of the upcoming book, which hopefully will be called Monsters Among Us.
I'm very curious about that. Have to keep an eye out for when it gets settled with the publisher and comes out. Uh, I'm not going to ask too much about it, obviously, because this is something coming out. I don't want to spoil it for people out there. I think most of of the people watching this are probably intrigued by now. What do you think, Drew?
Yeah, I'd say so. That's probably enough bait.
um, so of all the various creatures, I mean, you've written vampires and demons and Satan and all sorts of Cthulhu creatures. What's your favorite monster to work with?
I like vampires. To me, they're still the ultimate monster. They're intelligent predators. At least mine are, and they're not the mindless zombies. You could probably, unless there's a whole lot of them, you can avoid a zombie. Vampires are a lot harder to deal with, and I think they're just more the traditional monster.
And
Buffering on my end.
yeah, not yours is buffering on mine. But at least we have audio.
It's a it's a start. Um, so you were saying vampires as intelligent predators?
Yeah, they're intelligent predators. I said zombies are, at least the traditional ones are mindless unless you get a whole lot of them. They should be easy to avoid. Um, Vampires to me are the ultimate monster. And I was just saying that Bold Venture Press recently published a small volume called "Blood Is the Life," in which Bianca goes after three different vampires.
Yeah, I got that book as well, but I'm finishing Here There Be Monsters before I get to that one, just for the sake of trying to keep everything in together in one place. But I'm with you. I actually am very fond of vampires. When I way back when I was a kid, when I first started getting interested in the paranormal, vampire legends is where I got my start. Good heavens!
Yeah, I think vampire. I was at the Mysticon in Roanoke, Virginia last weekend,
Hmm.
and I was on a vampire panel, and just from the reaction of that, I think vampires might. I think the damage done by Twilight is finally fading, and I think vampires are about to make a comeback.
One can
Yeah,
hope.
I could hope so. Like most people I know, I'm not a big fan of Twilight. In no small part for what it did to the vampire legends and fiction.
Well, I could appreciate it in that it got a lot of people reading books, which is always a good thing.
This is true, and I'm not objecting to the fact that more people are reading.
That
Yeah, and hopefully some of the Twilight fans, graduated onto bigger and better vampires.
one can hope.
Yeah, it's
But
not
but
like there's a shortage of them.
I've noticed a trend in humanizing, if you will, a lot of our villains. You have to explain why Darth Vader's a bad guy. You have to explain why, Hannibal Lecter is a bad guy in his dietary choices. Um, just about every bad guy has to have a backstory that humanizes him. The only one they haven't really humanized yet is Kaiser Sose from The Usual Suspects.
But it certainly, and I can understand the tendency to a bit, just because I think from both a reality standpoint and a fictional standpoint, two-dimensional villains that are villains just for the sake of being villains can get a little stale, unless you can write them very well.
I can agree. I
Right.
agree with that, but at the same point, you don't necessarily need to actually delve into their backstory.
True.
Yeah. For instance, your traditional movie vampire, Count Dracula, and all those, they were very personable. They were very attractive. But then again, that's what evil is. It is attractive. It brings you into its sphere, and before you know it, you're trapped into it.
This is certainly true, and that is, I mean, Dracula himself, charming, personable. He has that element, and I guess it's kind of the thing. It's monsters we relate to. It's easier to see them as being normal and human with human failings, with human reasons. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that even among the human villains of the world, it isn't. Sometimes, there are psychopaths and sociopaths that do things just because they enjoy killing.
Yes.
And it's a flaw in that thinking. I think it's like we want our monsters to be understandable, to have this tortured they were tortured by the redheaded woman when they were a child, and now they go and kill redheads. And it's like, no, sometimes they just sometimes people just like killing people.
I think there's an element that's compelling, though, seeing yourself in the villain.
True.
Which, if your villain's completely unrelatable, you don't have that element of, it's harder to internalize that villain, or feel sympathy for them.
There's a certain freedom about being a villain in that even though you're breaking the law doesn't seem to apply to you. And up until the very end, you can get away with anything. If you've seen any of the old Warner Brother gangster movies, these gangsters are living a great life until the final shootout.
Yeah.
You sort of, in some cases, you identify with the gangster. You want to see him progress, but only up to a point. Usually because he's fighting other gangsters.
You've got a really good point there.
At the end, but based on the movie practice of the time, he could not be ultimately successful because the good had to win out at all times.
The Hays Code.
Right.
Yeah, which the Europeans laugh at us for.
It's sort of funny to just look at that by virtue of, back then the rule said the bad guy had to lose. Now those rules have been lifted, but we're trying to make the bad guy more human, more relatable. So that even if the villain wins, perhaps you still, or it's like, oh, okay, he won, but.
Yeah. Well, sometimes restrictions like that challenge the writer in a way that makes things better. When I started out, I was writing for a small press magazine. This is before the internet and all that. He would do it on copying machines. It was a guy named Tom Johnson, um, and he was a fan of the old pulps, and so whatever was permitted in the old pulps was permitted in his magazine, but whatever they didn't have, he wouldn't have. The strongest language you could use was hell or damn, and there was very little. I mean, sex had to be implied as opposed to explicit. And I wrote a series of stories which became the novel "The Devil of Harbor City," and you know, it was having those restrictions made you, first of all, made you come up with a lot better language because you couldn't rely on the usual words. You had instead, okay, okay, you motherless sons of dogs, rather than whatever else you could say. And lots of violence, but the closest I came to a sex scene was somewhere known only to them. Two lovers met. Afterwards, told you everything you had to know.
It sort of seems like there's a principle in horror that sort of applies here of it. What you see, well, in horror it said what you see is always the most. Not, what you don't see is the most terrifying. But your imagination could fill in the blanks about what happened with the two lovers from there, and I'm sure everyone's can. At least everyone who's
Yeah,
old enough.
I think that's one of the trouble with a lot of the movies these days is that they don't they stopped implying what things are like, and they feel the need, to tell you explicitly as if we don't have imaginations and can't figure it out for ourselves.
I have to agree with you there, and it's a thing. There are modern horror movies, and a lot of the older ones certainly, that don't rely on that so much, and they're, in my opinion, some of the best. Um,
Alien was one of the best haunted house movies I've ever seen, and you didn't see the monster until the very end.
yeah, and it's why. I mean, Aliens is science. It looks like a science fiction movie, but it works so well as a horror movie because you don't see the monster.
I mean, how long does it in them before you know what's going on?
I
Yeah.
was gonna.
Same thing with the movie Tremors.
Drew
It's the
under. Yeah.
suspense. It's the waiting for it that drives you crazy.
Yeah, I miss the old-fashioned pacing.
Similar tone. There's a movie that came out relatively recently that I thought had a really good take on the haunted object thing, which was Oculus. Did you see that,
No.
Drew?
I saw the first 15 minutes. That doesn't really count.
But it's this story about these two siblings who saw their father murder their mother in front of them and then kill himself when they're children, and they both were convinced that this antique mirror was the reason. So the son got sent off to the psych ward because everybody thought he was crazy. The evil mirror killed my parents, and the daughter becomes obsessed with proving it. And the way they balance it with the slow build and the messing with perceptions, they leave a lot of things unanswered. In okay, is the mirror actually haunted, or is it the mental instability in the two of them from that they inherited from their parents? And it just plays with that. The pacing's good. It's a good example of somebody remembering that you don't have to spell it all out for us.
The Babadook was another one that was really good that way.
I haven't seen it yet. I've heard good things.
So good. It's amazing, and it's pretty much the same sort of a deal, but I'm not going to give anything away.